Erst leer ich mir werde, sieht mich sündig all gesieht.
Certainly, Olavo de Carvalho was the most persecuted intellectual in the history of Brazilian scholarship. He was also one of the most betrayed and vilified by his own students, many of whom dishonorably take advantage of his work to this day. Likewise, not a few pseudo-intellectuals and detractors, many of them former students, make a point of hiding from the public the influence that Olavo de Carvalho had on their careers, and why not say, on their very lives. Even so, Olavo was the most important philosopher in Brazil from the 20th century onward, and it is no exaggeration to say that he was one of the most important in the world from the same period. This video series is not intended to be a biography, but rather to audio-visually explain an important contribution of this admirable Brazilian thinker to the field of human psychology. The definition of the psyche. Modern psychology emerged in the 19th century through the studies of Gustav Theodor Fechner and Wilhelm Wundt. These researchers developed studies on human perception, attempting to establish a boundary between the physiological and the psychological. In general, they studied psychology from specific psychic aspects such as perception, attention, memory, speech, the association of ideas, and so on. With psychoanalysis, the study of the temporal development of the human being emerged. This line of investigation proposes an evolutionary psychology of emotions, aiming to describe the major emotional frameworks of the individual based on their biography. Olavo emphasizes that this entire new line of study focuses on the phenomenon of neurosis, meaning it is a psychology viewed from the perspective of psychopathology. Thus, because all these psychologists began with a particular phenomenon to study psychology, the definitions they provide of psychology and psyche are, of course, all colored by this initial theme of investigation. Moreover, none of them raised questions like, does the psyche exist? What is the psyche? Currently, to define the psyche, psychologists limit themselves to enumerating psychological facts such as memory, attention, speech, desires, and intentions. Without providing us with an ontological definition, modern psychology presents only designations that catalogue the constituent elements of the psyche, allowing solely the distinction of these elements from those that do not belong to it. However, we are deprived of important information, such as whether this enumeration is complete, or if external elements might also be part of it. To this insufficient definition, we can add the classical definitions, stemming from Aristotle and scholasticism, which precedes psychology itself. Olavo elaborates his concept starting from two inquiries. First, what does the psychologist mean when using the term psyche? That is, what are their underlying, even if obscure, intentions? How do they distinguish what is psyche from what is not, even without knowing exactly what it is, since it is something almost impossible to define? In his own words, although saying they don't know how to define the psyche, the psychologist somehow always seems to know what it is about, not reflexively, but in an empirical, usual, customary way. Second, what does the psychologist mean when attributing a certain behavior to a psychic cause? Where does the psychologist locate this cause among an infinite number of other possible causes? Olavo concludes, there is no cause for these acts that cannot be classified within the framework of physical, logical, chance, or psychological causes. Physical cause. When the act is motivated by a physical necessity. For example, when an individual pulls back their foot after stepping on a thorn. This type of cause cannot be classified as psychological. Logical cause. When the act is motivated by a fixed external order that applies to all individuals, directing them to react more or less in the same way due to a matter of logic. For example, when we change lanes upon seeing an obstacle in the distance on the road. According to the professor, all actions that are based on logical reasons evident to any human being cannot be said to have been caused psychologically because they are caused by something that is evidently beyond the psyche. When doing the math 2 + 2, I get the result 4, which was not determined by me because it is not a psychological matter, but rather the structure of the number itself. Just like the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. This conclusion is not reached due to a psychological reason. It is imposed on us by the structure of the right triangle. Logical acts do not compel us by physical imposition, but by the free acceptance of external logic. This does not mean arriving at a logical conclusion, but accepting it. Evidently, there is a psychological element at the root of the acceptance of logical behavior. But the behavior itself is no longer psychological, which is beyond question. It is intellectual in the sense that it grasps an ontological requirement, something that is beyond the individual, beyond their psyche. Chance. It occurs when there is such a large multiplicity of causes that it is impossible to enumerate them. For example, when we choose a lane that coincidentally would present an obstacle before we notice it and are forced to change lanes. There is some cause for this initial choice, but recreating the entire chain of events to explain it would be too unproductive, making chance the simplest and most satisfactory explanation. Chance is not precisely that which has no cause, but that which has a multiplicity of causes, some of which may be physical, others psychological, meaning it is an unfathomable chain of causes. The psychological cause. Beyond the first three causes, an act can have a psychic cause, which is primarily characterized by acting through the other causes. Olavo defines, the psyche is a zone of indeterminacy where man combines causes of a physical, logical, and causal order. Distinction between psyche and chance. Clearly, the definition implies an element of indeterminacy. Therefore, what differentiates the psychological cause from chance? The difference is that, in the psychological cause, the combination of physical, logical, and causal elements is combined as a function of the individual. Olavo says that the psyche is as if it were an efficient causality, an indeterminacy, within which the other causes can be combined to a certain extent in the sense of the interest of the individual organism. Psychopathology. If the psyche operates in the interest of the individual, how can psychopathology be explained? The answer is that, In the psychopathological individual, the psyche yields space previously dominated by it to the spheres of physical need, logic, or chance. Mental illnesses exist, but they are not of the sphere of the psyche. They represent merely an abdication of the freedom of the psychic field to the other causes. It is very easy to perceive that, in the mentally ill, automatic mental processes, which, in this case, will be labeled as physical need, have a much greater dominance over the totality of conduct than in the healthy individual. Considering automatism as a physical need, if it takes the lead, there is therefore a retreat of the psyche. Similarly, in certain schizophrenic processes, when logical conduct takes the lead, that is, when the subject is dominated by an implacable logic, there is a loss of freedom in the sense of retreating from a logical chain when it leads to conclusions that violate the integrity of the organism, as, for example, in the state of catatonia, in which the subject no longer reacts to logical reasoning. Their psyche closes in on itself, retracting, so that the subject becomes totally unable to react. That is, they are in a state of paralysis that is of a logical order. One can then make the following representation. This diagram expresses only the causes when viewed from the outside. But when observing an individual's behavior, we ask for its cause. Looking from the inside, this diagram would look a little different, because we say that the psyche, by its very nature, tends to hoard, to eat away at a part of the zone of the other three domains. Ideally, the new diagram would look like this. We can see that there is an overlapping area. The psyche exerts control over a portion of our logical needs, physical desires, and random events. It only becomes a tangible action or behavior within this overlapping space. So, what remains purely psychological stays as a mere possibility. Therefore, we can conclude that the psyche, by its very nature, is a potential, a collection of endless possibilities, and it only becomes real through physical, logical, and random influences. Characteristics of the psyche. Efficiency. The psyche is capable of acting and producing results. Freedom. The psyche has the capacity to choose and act autonomously. Creativity. The psyche is capable of generating new ideas and solutions. Regarding individuality, it's worth reiterating what has already been stated. The psyche, under normal conditions, acts in the interest of the individual organism. Hence, this characteristic that gives it the attribute of individuality. The psyche does not exist on its own. We only know of psyches bound to individual organisms. The psyche of a human, the psyche of another human, the psyche of a plant, of an animal, just as we cannot speak of life itself, for life does not exist except in individualized living organisms. Life is not like energy. We can conceive of energies dispersed and located in a space where there is no individual being. We can understand, for example, that this room is crossed by energy currents all the time, but it cannot be crossed by lives or psyches in the same way. This reminds us of Goethe's phrase, "Nature seems to have bet on individuality."